of living together in peace. We are highlighting the interconnections between gender and violence, women and peace, dimensions that are sometimes given short shrift in the public discourse on crime, but in fact are so critical to consider if we are really to advance towards societies that are genuinely and sustainably equal, safe, just, and peaceful. To tell us more about what's in store today, I will now hand you over to our moderator for the webinar, Dr. Leah Claiborne. And Dr. Claiborne herself has research interests in areas such as access to the criminal justice system, victimization and victims, gender and crime, and gender-based violence within the context of the Caribbean and global peripheries. Her recent research has explored intimate partner violence in same-gender relationships in the Caribbean and the victims' access to criminal justice. She currently works at the Nottingham Trent University as a lecturer in criminology and as the exchange coordinator for the criminology department there. She is also a series editor for the Gender and Crime in a Globalized World series, published by the Bristol University Press. She also serves as a trustee on the Nottinghamshire Sexual Violence Support Services. Over to you, Dr. Claiborne.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and good day to everyone. Yes, it's morning here, there, and afternoon here. So you're all now winding up and I'm winding down for the day. But I'm so happy to be here to help with this conversation and as we go forward. So really and truly, what I would like to do firstly is just have a brief talk about, just very small, about what we want to do today, and then introduce our dynamic panel full of persons that have a number of expertise in various areas, and they've come together and we hope to have a very interesting discussion, and we'll have questions afterwards. So as Caribbean nationals, most of us are here. We do know that in the Caribbean, we are currently having this conversation, not only Trinidad and Tobago or Jamaica or Barbados or any other, but as a region, we're having these conversations about issues around homicide and crime and violence within the region, understanding that we are increasingly seeing higher records of homicides across the region. And also it's more concerning because when compared to the global average, sometimes we're a bit more than the global average, right? So this has led leaders, policymakers to start having this conversation around the epidemic of crime and violence in the region, and looking at things such as organized crime, gangs, illegal drugs, the arms trade, and all these conversations that we're having, violent and non-violent crime, serious crime, gender-based crimes as well, and gender-based violence. And we have this understanding that it's not only about persons are committing crimes and persons are becoming victims of crime, but also institutions within our countries and within our communities are feeling the strain. So we say, talking about the healthcare services, educational services, social support services, all these services are being impacted by the situation in which we've now found ourselves in. So really and truly today, what we want to do is add another element to that conversation, right? Just recently, we had the regional symposium, CARICOM had its regional symposium, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But today, what we really want to focus on, and the bulk of our conversation is going to be around this issue of gender and its relationship to these issues. And in particular, looking at this from looking at feminist perspectives, right? Because as a criminologist myself, there are various ways we can look at this particular issue. And one of them that I'm most interested in as well, so that's why I'm very happy to be here, is looking at this from a feminist perspective and looking at, in particular, how this has an impact on gender. And the UN in 2013, UNODC in 2013, talked about the different impact crime, drugs, terrorism, and all these things have on women and men, because they have different experiences going through the criminal justice system. And this is not, we're just saying this, but this is what the research says. And therefore, men and women have different responsibilities and different responses and different experiences when it comes to dealing with crime and justice, being offenders and being victims. So therefore, when we're talking about crime and justice and all these things, we have to talk about it as well from this gender perspective. So they have different priorities, responsibilities, needs relating to the reduction of crime and the achievement of security and justice. They have different levels of access to participation, information, and justice, and face different constraints in their effects to improve their security and their social conditions. They also play different parts in responding to and making decisions about crime and crime prevention. If we go into the academic talk about it, you will hear that women respond differently than men to domestic violence and all these things, right? So they play this very different role in responding and making decisions about crime and crime prevention and building secure societies, developing fair, accessible, accountable, effective, and credible criminal justice institutions. So therefore, gender and talking about it in this way is very, very important. And one of the ways in which we've spoken about gender is through this feminist discourse. So really and truly, that's what we want to today. We want to raise awareness about the gender dimensions of crime and differential impacts on women in the region, look at the importance of gender mainstreaming and women's equal participation in anti-crime policy making processes, improve the understanding of crime prevention within the context of a broader feminist human rights concept of peace, and also increase the capacity of stakeholders, even ourselves as moderator and panelists, and persons who are just here generally, just for information, but increase our capacity to be advocates, be more and be advocates for more gender-aware solutions to crime, and really and truly be empowering ourselves to play a part in preventing or responding to crime, whether it be in our homes, our workplaces, our communities, or wherever we are. So now I would like to introduce our great panel. So firstly, I would like to introduce to all of you, Dr. Armstrong Alexis, who is the Deputy Secretary General of CARICOM. He is a St. Lucian. He has also graduated from Walden University in the United States and holds a doctoral degree in business administration and an MBA from the University of Durham in the UK, and a graduate of the University of West Indies, Mona campus in Jamaica, with a Master of Science degree in sociology and a Bachelor of Science degree in social work. Dr. Alexis has held numerous leadership positions, both as a volunteer and professionally. He joined the Caribbean Community Secretariat in November 2022 as the Deputy Secretary General. He joined the Caribbean Community Secretariat after serving as Deputy Resident Representative of United Nations Development Program in Namibia Country Office. And prior to his assignment in Namibia, Dr. Alexis served as a Deputy Resident Representative and Functional Head of Office for the UNDP in Suriname. He has also served as a coordinator for program and operations at the UNDP Pacific Center in Fiji, as well as the Functional Deputy to the Resident Representative of, of the Multi-Country Office for Samoa, Nui, Cook Islands, right? He's also been an operations manager with the UNDP sub-regional office in Barbados, and has taken on a number of special mission assignments for UNDP, right? Notably as the Deputy Country Director for Operations and ad interim in Haiti in 2010, Human Resource and Training Coordinator for UNDP headquarters in New York in 2013, and Special Operations Advisor in Nigeria in 2019, right? Before joining United Nations 2007, Dr. Alexis served as a Regional Director for the Commonwealth Youth Program in the Caribbean, bearing responsibility for supporting government initiatives on youth development throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean. So definitely we know Dr. Alexis has commendable amount of experience in the public sector, having served at also senior levels with the government of St. Lucia, in academia with the University of West Indies. And we are very happy that he's here to talk to us today. And in his current post, he oversees the corporate services and functional management of the Secretariat and acts on the delegated responsibility of the CARICOM Secretary General in all aspects of the functions of the Secretariat. So we welcome Dr. Alexis here today, and thank you for coming. Ms. Folade Mutoto is one of the 3 founders and current executive director of the Women's Institute for Alternative Development, WINAD, which is headquartered in Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Folade is also a coordinator of the Caribbean Coalition for Development and Reduction of Armed Violence. Just a little background on the Caribbean Coalition for Development and the Reduction of Armed Violence is a Caribbean civil society advocacy group to reduce and prevent the illicit proliferation and misuse of small arms and light weapons, right? And the organization has led the regional society campaign to successfully lobby CARICOM's member states to champion the negotiation of a robust arms trade treaty at the UN in 2013. So Folade brings with her to this session, her womanist perspective to her work and security and small arms control, along with her advocacy skills developed over a lifetime of community engagement, social policy development, research, and leading change. Then we have Dr. Deborah McPhee, and she is the Outreach and Research Officer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine campus, Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Deborah McPhee currently serves as the chair of the board of the Women's Institute for Alternative Development. Her area of expertise lies in women, gender, and development in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Anglophone Caribbean. She has operated as a public policy practitioner and researcher in this field since 1998. Her peer-reviewed mainstreaming in the Caribbean and women and gender human security and the national gender her peer-reviewed publications include research on gender national policies and politics of policymaking in the Caribbean, rethinking gender mainstreaming in the Caribbean, and women, gender, human security, and national gender policy in post-genocide Rwanda. Her research interests include women, gender, and public policy, gender and human security, the impact of small arms and light weapons on women and girls in select communities in Trinidad, and gender and climate change. So we thank Dr. McPhee for being here, and we welcome her, and we hope to hear more from her as well, and all our speakers. And last but not least, we have Marlon Bascom, who is an active member of the Caribbean Male Action Network. He has been advocating for men, and fathers in particular, to have a greater positive image in our society. He's a pastor and also serves as a vice president of his church, Warriors Assembly International, and has been involved in many training with respect to youth development, including mediation and conflict resolution. He's also a trained life skills tutor and was previously employed with the Citizen Security Program in Trinidad as a community action officer working toward long-term reduction of crime and violence. He's currently employed with the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, looking at investigations and as a manager, acting manager in the investigations and intervention unit. And he's been part of many projects that focuses on youth and young males in particular, right? He holds a bachelor's degree in sociology, a postgraduate diploma in international relations, and an international master's degree in business administration. He has been applying his academic studies both professionally and personally, and working with NGOs inclusive of Families in Action and Save a Youth, Save a Life. In 2016, Marlon was selected or has been selected by the UN Women to function in two capacities. Firstly, as a UN Women gender advocate for the Caribbean region, and also he has been appointed to the Civil Society Advisory Group of the UN Multi-Country Office, Caribbean. Marlon is also a director and lead consultant in his consultancy Caribbean Associates for Life Skills, Mediation and Management. So we thank all our panelists for being here, and we look forward to the discussion. So first up, what we would like to do is go to have a bit of an overview of the regional discussions on crime and violence. So as we are all aware, just recently we've had, in the Caribbean, we had a symposium, the Regional Symposium on Violence as a Public Health Issue, the Crime Challenge. And this webinar, all is not because of that, it's very timely. So first and foremost, what we'd like to do is invite Dr. Alexis to provide a brief overview of some of the key areas of discussion at the recent regional symposium, looking at some of the intended outcomes and next steps, including those articulated in the declaration by the heads of government of CARICOM, right? Looking at crime and violence as a public health issue. So Dr. Alexis, thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Let me take this opportunity to say a very warm good morning, and in your case, Madam Moderator, good afternoon to all my fellow panelists and to all those who are participating as attendees in this very important subject area. Whilst feminist theory provides a framework that allows for consideration of the unique social positioning and life experiences of women, I cannot profess to be speaking from the life experiences, but rather from a perspective that is guided by a philosophy of equality, non-discrimination, tolerance, respect for diversity, etc. I am one who subscribes to the examination of society through the lenses that allow us to understand the contributions of and the impact on women as a dominant demographic in all aspects of human civilization. It is that conviction of mine that led me to accept the invitation to present some thoughts on today's topic, and I congratulate the Caribbean in Leadership Regional Network of Women for both putting on this morning's event and for inviting me as one of your presenters. I'm deeply honored. As the moderator has indicated, only recently, Caribbean leaders met in Trinidad and Tobago over a 2-day period to discuss the issues relevant to crime and violence in our society, particularly crime and violence from the perspective as a health issue. One might wonder why crime and violence as a health issue. The truth of the matter is that there is a nexus between the incidence of crime and violence, particularly violent crime, and the health services of our respective member states. Over the years, there has been an increase in the number of homicides, for example. There has been tremendous pressures placed on the health sector, particularly emergency rooms. Other attendant issues such as the blood bank have been under tremendous strain. The effects of violence against persons have resulted in a number of persons losing limbs, for example, suffering various forms of physical injury, stabbings, which therefore requires more and more attention paid to the health and safety of citizens. And that is what prompted the heads of government to engage in a conversation around the issue related to crime and violence as a health issue. Amongst the issues raised was the question of violence against women and girls. We have often read in the literature that violence against women and girls is a silent epidemic. I believe in the Caribbean it is now transcended from being an issue of a silent epidemic to being a real epidemic. We hear of cases on a very regular basis in a number of member states of very, very serious injury to women. And in many cases, the death of women as a result of domestic violence, as a result of violence committed upon women by persons who are familiar to them. Usually spousal violence is a main perpetrator of the crimes against women. And that was one of the major issues coming out of the conversation amongst the heads a few weeks ago in Trinidad and Tobago. The heads, therefore, committed to ensuring that the services that are offered by member states, both within the health sector and as part of national security, would focus, one of the primary focus areas will be on ensuring the reduction and eventual elimination of violence against women and girls. That has been seen as one of the major areas in which engagements ought to be undertaken if we are to return to a peaceful and loving society that the Caribbean has always been known for. There are quite a number of other recommendations. I will not go through every single one of the recommendations in the communique. I imagine the communique has been read by all those who are interested in this topic. But to relate those matters to the issues around gender and from the lens and the perspective of ensuring that a discussion on crime does not only relate to the male aspects of the epidemic. The heads have made some very determined considerations for ensuring that in as much as we address gang violence, which is largely a male phenomena, we also pay special attention to violence against women and girls. I will stop here, Madam Moderator, and during the course of the conversation, we can go deeper into some of the outcomes of that very important and historic event that was held in Trinidad a couple of weeks ago.
So thank you very much, Dr. Alexis, for just that update of what happened at the symposium. It's very interesting that we talk about violence against women and girls, and it's an issue that's pressing globally, and there's a lot of conversation going on about it. So what we really want to turn to now is have a conversation around gender dimensions of crime and violence in the Caribbean. So as previously stated, when I opened, I started the conversation about understanding that crime impacts men and women very differently, how they respond to it, how the criminal justice responds to them. It's quite different. Their access to it is quite different. And there are a number of reasons why access is very different between men and women as it relates to dealing with crime and how they respond to crime and whether they are victims and offenders. And there's always this thing that I like to do when I have some students, and I try to bring it in sometimes so when I be in these forums, is if we close our eyes and we think about the offender of crime, sometimes what pops up is a male image, right? And we often assume, so therefore in our minds, we quite naturally, not even having any understanding about crime and violence as academics or researchers, we have this understanding of, or this idea of who should be a criminal or who may be considered a criminal in gendered terms. So therefore, when we're talking about this issue, we need to talk about it in gendered terms. So we have to have this conversation. So we understand that there's gender differentiated impacts of crime and violence on women and girls, boys and men. And when we talk about that, we're also talking about small arms and light weapons, right? We understand too that as much as we understand that we, as laypersons, we may think that we know that, or we believe that men are offenders, but they are also victims. But we also have women who are victims of crime, and in particular, around the context of gender-based violence. And we have studies of 5 Caribbean countries showing that on average, 46% of the women in the region have experienced at least one form of violence in their lifetime, right? In November 2022, a report by Gender Equality Observatory for Latin America, they found that at least 12 women were killed per day on the basis of their gender in 29 countries and territories in the region. So when we're thinking about gender and crime, we need to start thinking about victims and survivors, and we have to start talking about that in terms of gender, not necessarily only about the seriousness of the crime or type of crime, but also in terms of how it's gender different, the gender differentials in these issues. And what we want to have a conversation about more so, and it's something that is really important for us to look at, because it's definitely an issue when you talk about, for example, Reuters talks about the high rates of gun violence in the Caribbean. And a Geneva-based small arms survey talked about Caribbean countries suffering 3 times more violent deaths than the global average. And these are often caused by firearms, even though we have regulations around gun ownership, and we don't really domestically as a region manufacture guns. Interpol, firearms are used in more than 70% of murders in the Caribbean. So there's a need to understand this impact of not only gun crime on statistics, but gun crime or the use of firearms and small arms on women in the Caribbean. What are the impacts as has to women? And it's not an area that's largely explored. So I would like us to start considering how small arms and light weapons impact women and girls. So what I would like to do now is invite Ms. Folade Mututa to join the conversation. So Ms. Mututa, you would have been involved in some research in this area through your work of through WINAD and CDRAV. So can you share some of the studies your studies finding with us?
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. You were providing a background for us, and it occurred to me that I really would like to start my contribution to our conversation today by taking a brief moment and inviting all of us to reflect and acknowledge the fear that we are experiencing as people, as individuals living in a region that is so conflicted and that brings us so much grief on a daily basis. As you were speaking, it occurred to me that may be a good place to start, acknowledging the fear that all of us are experiencing and what that fear is doing to us and how it has changed the way that we live and we love in this region. So, sounds a bit morbid, but I just felt I had to start there when I listened to you presenting the background to our conversation. But let me go on to say thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to learn. I want to start by recognizing Dr. Deborah McPhee, who is the chair of the Women's Institute for Alternative Development, WINAD, my friend and colleague. And I'm seeing a number of activists that I've worked with over time in the audience. I want to recognize you, acknowledge you, and say thank you for the work that you've done to keep us safe and to promote the advancement of the rights of women and girls. I think that for us to talk about the work that CDRAV has done and WINAD has done, we have to firstly contextualize the presence of small arms and light weapons in our lives. And in doing so, we have to take into account our history, that history of violence that all of Caribbean society has evolved out of, and the policies that emboldened that experience of violence, the legislation that gave life to those policies, and the various institutions over time that were introduced to suppress our resistance, but also the gendered systems at play in shaping our, what we call our democracies these days, right? But also shaping our lives. And the ways in which the hewers of wood and drawers of water become the target of all of our fear, our outrage, our confusion, our frustration, our scorn, but also our benevolence, you know, because I think that this complex reality does not allow us to simplify people's lives. You know, we can't chuck people into a box and say, you are there and you are here. It really doesn't allow us to do that and to simplify people's lives. And that is including the lives of women and girls, right? So how do small arms and light weapons impact women and girls, you ask? And statistically, we find that gun homicide for women in our region is higher than the global average. Our statistics say 1.7, 100,000 gun homicides that women are victims of, and the global average is 0.54. And of course, in large measure, our problem has to do, and those homicides have to do and result from intimate partner violence, which was referred to earlier at the top by Dr. Alexis. I think we also have to examine the cost of women's sense of security in our homes where firearms are held, for example. How do we analyze a woman's experience who is forced into sex when a firearm is placed at arm's length, you know, or a girl who's a victim of sexual violence and cannot report it for fear of further harm to herself or her family members? What about a partner of a law enforcement officer, for example, who's afraid to leave the abusive relationship because of the fear of harm? So physically and emotionally, I think there's impact that we can speak to say nothing, of course, of the financial challenges when, for one reason or another, a woman is unable to work or to meet commitments she has. She may be an entrepreneur, an independent entrepreneur. She may have problems meeting commitments she has to her clients because of firearm criminality in public spaces or in her community, but also sometimes because of the repressive counter firearms measures implemented by the state, which can be very disruptive to her movements and her livelihood, you know, or legislation that we're putting in place that criminalize what we're referring to as aiding and abetting, and therefore can affect very many women because of their proximity to a perpetrator, for example. And so the business about this legislation that we're introducing, I know certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, about harboring a gang member, you know, in some discussions, it may seem fair because some people feel that women enable gang violence and gang behavior and that kind of thing, particularly mothers, that they enable illicit activity, that they some of them benefit from crime and so on and so forth. But I think that we have to take into account the whole question of coercion, and therefore you know, as we try to remedy what we think is this huge epidemic and this ill, we really have to take into account how different people's lives are complicated by the existence of firearms, both in public and in private spaces. And just to wrap, I'll say that there needs to be a spotlight on sexual violence in particular. There's not a lot of discussion around that issue because the data is you know, fairly difficult to come by, but we need to pay more attention to the business of sexual violence. And just to return to my point about the coercion, I know of a woman, for example, her son was engaged in firearm-related criminality, and he lived with her. Not that she did not try to change that circumstance several times, but then he started to threaten her. She was in no position really to evade the police coming into the home and finding the firearms and charging her for possession, you know. So those are realities that women experience on a day-to-day basis. And I just want to encourage us as we discuss this and other issues to take into account that we must never try to simplify people's lives. It's really too complex to do that. Thank you very much, moderator.
Thank you very much, Ms. Palati. It's very interesting what you said there about, you know, and this kind of goes back to work around, especially looking at work in the Caribbean in general, taking from, I believe it is Maureen Kane in the 1990s, where starting up talking about crime and criminology in the Caribbean and saying that, you know what, we need to start looking at the lived experiences of people to understand, you know, it's not simply about numbers. And this led me to just have a general look about, even in this, because in prepping for this, I myself didn't know much about when it came to talking about small arms and women, right? We always know that crime has an impact on women. I understand all of these things, but in particular, and it just led me to look at just generally, and it says that, I think it's from Amnesty International, talking about there's an estimate of 650 million small arms in the world today. 60% of that in the hands of private individuals who are mostly men. So what does that mean? Especially now in the region where we have this issue of guns coming into the country, or various countries and various communities. What does it mean for women? Because if we're saying 60% of these guns globally are in the hands of men, and these are the users, the dealers, the buyers, the owners, the sellers, these are all men, it's definitely going to have an impact on women. And we definitely have to have that conversation and fill that conversation about violence committed with guns against women, the role of women in gun use, and their campaigns where we have women are spearheading against gun violence. Because I think sometimes when we think about anti-gun violence, especially if we look at other countries, at the forefront of that conversation are usually women as well. So it's very interesting, and it's definitely a conversation that we need to have more of. But going to the first point about violence being committed against women, there's also this conversation that, and you talked about even having a conversation about sexual violence and issues around coercion and stuff like that. And some people will say, well, you know what, in Caribbean, it's not necessarily a crime problem, we have a violence problem. Going back to, if we talk about, what's her name? In looking at, talking about the cultural violence that exists, and you talk about this, looking at the history of Caribbean countries and history of the region. And historically, we talk about there's a cultural violence, especially in gender-based violence and domestic violence. We talk about there's a history of violence, especially a history of violence against women, where it was kind of signed off on very early on, where you had, during indentureship, you had wife looters and all these things. And even as though colonial government tried to deal with these issues, it still had, it's part of the history, it's part of our history. Because what we saw happening was this political violence between master and slave, or masters and indentured laborers and all these individuals. And then we saw it transferring within the family to at a horizontal level, where these men would take out their frustrations on women, and women would be subject to that same level of the violence that they would have experienced, right? So we have to have that conversation, and we especially around sexual violence and all of that. But also, again, comes back to not necessarily a crime problem, but a violence problem, and also stemming from our history and culture of violence that take that within the region. And while we talk about, yes, we know we have issues around gang violence and all of that, there's this argument that gang violence begins in the home, right? So our question, I want to raise this question: how is family violence, intimate partner violence, child abuse a major part of the problem of violence in society as a whole? Right? So I would like all our panelists to have a conversation about this. So I'll firstly invite again Ms. Matota to start us off, and then we could follow by Dr. McPhee, Dr. Alexis, and then Mr. Basco. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. I think that power is exercised, it is enabled, it is rewarded through various forms of violence at different moments, in different places, in different spaces, and so on. And so we all live in these circumstances we deem to protect us or maintain social order, you know? And so, quite frankly, I think that violence is socially acceptable. It becomes a problem for us when there's injury or if there's death. So that for many of us, we're okay with corporal punishment, for example, or with women experiencing the range of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, until, like I said, it becomes a serious injury, or it results in her demise. So I think that when we talk about violence, and how is violence contributing, violence that happens in the home and in intimate partner relationships and so on, we have to take into account our appetite, our tolerance level, really, for violence. And when violence is perpetrated against certain people, because it really is not acceptable to act out violence against all people. But for some people, it is entirely acceptable that they experience violence of one sort or another, whether it's verbal or otherwise. And, you know, I have to tell you, I belong to Trinidad and Tobago, so that I do not come to this conversation, or any conversation for that matter, without bringing the issues of social class, even geography, ethnicity, race. Those issues are important for my understanding of the world. And I think when we talk about violence, they're very, very critical and central, because it's one of those spaces where we understand how people are treated differently. Earlier on, you talked about access and that sort of thing. Some people just experience life quite different to very many others. And I don't know that our treatment of this problem can be approached without dealing with that, because it really has, we even see it in the structure of the trade. when we talk about small arms and light weapons and the movement and that sort of thing. So that the one fear I always have when we start talking about family violence though, is that women get so much beat up and accusations. You know, they say when the child is walking the straight and narrow, it is our child. When the child is not, it is your child, the woman. So you have responsibility. So that I'm sure that won't happen in this discussion, but I need to also say that. Thank you very much.
Dr. Murphy.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. Are you hearing me well? Yeah. I'd like to say thanks to CWIL for having this panel discussion and inviting me to be a part of it. The panelists, fellow panelists, particularly my friend and colleague and mentor, Ms. Folade Matucha. It's an honor to be with you. And like Folade, I'd like to honor those women that I see in the audience who have made space for conversations like this over the years. It's good to see you all with us. I'm going back to the whole idea of what this feminist conversation, theorizing, allows us to see around crime. And when I first saw it, I said, what we often do is that we don't spend time at the intersections. It's very important that we understand that the analysis that allows us to frame crime beyond just constructing an enemy is something that is very, very important for us in the region. I heard the chair speak to that essay Professor Brereton penned many years ago about the history of the region and the extent to which we have lived with violence over time. And it's a very seminal, very important essay in terms of us contextualizing this crime conversation, because what it also sets us up to understand very clearly are movements like the ways in which our social welfare structures came to be out of like the Moyne Commission that was really in conversation with a number of our social ills, including crime. And so in preparation for this conversation, I went back to that Moyne Commission report. And one of the observations, even in 1930 something, we were being engaged with was the differences in men and women, how they entered the prison system, and the ways in which our young children, who were often penalized harshly for minor criminal offenses, were in a prison system that didn't make room for their rehabilitation. And so these are the conversations, I think, when we talk about crime and violence, and that feminist analysis, what I am appreciating with that movement is the fact that, one, we would spend time looking at intersections. So we're looking at the ways in which the state public policy in response to crime and violence may not always be able to see who are the victims very well. We're also looking at an analysis that makes the invisible visible. So in our crime conversation, one thing you want to know is who we're missing and how we construct people. Because what I find interesting with the gender conversation is that we talk about men and women, but ultimately the gender conversation is not only about maleness and femaleness. The gender conversation also is the way in which it's packaged race, class, and how we understand those geography. Those are important markers when we seek to have conversations around gender. So I think it's really important for us to spend some time looking at those structural, for me, and that's because that's my research interest, for me, it would always be public policy responses that in some way have both historically and currently not necessarily seek to unpack the depth of who we are. And I think in terms of the construction of the enemy approach, that is, you have identified a group, a sect as the problem, and we are setting up conversations in relation to that. That is not, I don't think it has been helpful for us. And I do think that it is something that we need to revisit. So honestly, when I heard CARICOM speak to the issue of health in all our imperfections, I appreciated that movement, because to me, it started another type of conversation. So I had all these lovely, lovely, lovely thoughts around just maybe we will then be able to diagnose our children. We talk about violence within the family. I would diagnose our children who may not be well, whether it's mental health, whether it's maybe those services will become accessible. Yeah. And the list mightn't be so long. And then I started to think about maybe, just maybe, public policy around crime and criminality will not seek to live in the broad areas, but seek to make sense of those identities, the markers, the geography, the school situation, the fact that I may have a learning disability and I may live all my life and never be diagnosed with it. In this Caribbean, maybe we will begin to have that intersectional conversation. And I am hopeful that we will have that intersectional conversation. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. McPhee. Very interesting points that you made here about looking at, in particular, differences in men and women engaging in crime and imprisonment and that type of stuff. I think it was a quote by Wu Jin starting about gendering criminology. She said, if men started to behave like women, the prisons would be empty. So it also signifies that how we think about crime and violence from very early on internationally about the issue of the roots of violence and violence in the home and all these things, and associating violence as a marker of masculinity. But also you are quite correct in the form of, we need to actually have more sort of conversation about intersectionality as well, and have put those things into our conversations about crime and violence in the region. So, and this is where I want to bring in particular, Mr. Bascom and Dr. Alexis. When we start talking about violence and unmasking the reality of violence and looking at that in relation to masculinity, and we heard a little bit about it from Dr. McPhee and Ms. Mutoto. Can you help us unpack why are we having this conversation about the root of violence and unmasking the reality that violence is often a mark of masculinity? What are the conversations that have been having on the CARICOM policy level and even within men's groups and these types of things around the issue of crime and violence, essentially? So let's go with Dr. Alexis first and then Mr. Bascom.
Okay, well, thanks. I think we can return to some basic principles of socialization and what we have come to accept as the norms and values that shape our society. Any one of us who've been exposed to sociological thought will know that that there are agents of socialization, of which the family is considered to be the primary agent of socialization. The church, our peers, when we were teenagers, we were influenced by our peers. We're influenced by other structures in the society, including the media. So just to sort of connect that with the initial comment or the initial conversation around the role of the family, we cannot escape the fact that the family is the primary source of socialization, and therefore a lot starts with the family. But the family is also a microcosm of the rest of the society, and therefore what provides the family with its rudder to be able to instill those values and mores in our young people becomes a more difficult conversation to have. So there are a lot of interplays, and there's a lot of connectivity across the board. I believe, though, that how we analyze the situation is just as important as what the situation is, because there are times when our analyses result in the kinds of messages that we portray and we share with the public, and that in itself can become part of the challenge. So, for example, over the years in the Caribbean, there's been a lot said about the fact that at the University of the West Indies, more females are registering than males. But I often ask the question, and just to take you back to my own background, my master's in sociology, I studied men and the family. My dissertation for my master's in sociology was on Caribbean men and the family. And from as far back as then, my question was always, why is it that we are problematizing the fact that more women are registering and as a result graduating from university? But when there were more men registering and graduating, that was never an issue of analysis. So the issue for me is not what number of boys or men attending university. The issue for me is really, what are the options? What else are men getting involved with? And just to sort of quote one of the seminal works that have been done on this issue, we have work that has been done that shows, for example, from Davis and Greenstein, who have argued that the traditional gender role expectations are that men are expected to be breadwinners and women homemakers. And I contend, therefore, that such a restricted option of, that the restricted option of careers that men currently have and the employment opportunities or the lack of employment opportunities have caused a lot of our young men, in particular in the Caribbean, to shift the value that was once placed on formal education. The issue is that there may be a thin line between the options for performing that traditional role of breadwinner with some of the antisocial behaviors that we're seeing in our society today. That thin line, because many of our young men are of the view, and perhaps from direct experiences, that the formal education system does not adequately cater for that traditional role of breadwinner. Now, I'm not suggesting that the traditional role of breadwinner should be perpetuated, but it is what it is, and we have to face the reality. And as a result of that, we have our men moving into other areas. That blurriness, therefore, that comes as a result of paying less attention to formal education, paying attention to what pays, and what pays may not always be within the legal realm. We therefore have a problem. Equally, as women adopt more roles beyond that of homemaker, which has been seen as a traditional role for women, a vacuum exists within the domestic realm. Traditionally, our societies have been that women occupy the domestic realm, men occupy the non-domestic realm. As women expand their horizons, rightfully so, there obviously remains a vacuum. And what that vacuum is filled with is perhaps what generates a lot of the antisocial behavior that we see, particularly amongst our young people, who obviously require that agent called the family for effective socialization. So the reality being what it is, our ability to analyze that and the messaging that is shared as a result must all be taken into consideration when determining policy. And whilst the responsibility for policy formulation is that of governments, we have to recognize as well that there is room for engaging more and more civil society, non-state actors in the definition of those policies if we are to ensure that we begin to address the issues properly and we begin to find answers that are not only seen as the official response to crime and violence in our society, but that is seen as a whole of society response that involves all stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexis. Now I turn it across to you, Mr. Basco.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for being here as I attempt to represent Kariman, as well as to my fellow panelists. There are so many things I have to catch up on with respect to all that they would have shared in this engaging discussion, particularly what Dr. McPhee said about the fact that we don't spend enough time on at the intersections. I thought that was very critical. So in trying to add to the discussion today, Kariman would have recently conducted a study that will be launched in the upcoming months in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. And in it, we looked at an examination of the masculinity facets in attempting a deeper understanding of males in the Caribbean in particular, self-perception, male roles in the Caribbean societies, the challenges men face and the interactions with the dynamics of gender. Because we believe that an understanding of these linkages is important for reducing gender-based crime rates, for fostering peace building through gender transformative frameworks, and addressing those vestiges of violence that linger on from our violent past, as Ms. Mutola was highlighting earlier, right? And I also wanted to start off then by agreeing with Dr. Alexis that our research showed that men hold very traditional views of masculinity, in that they associate masculinity with what they believe a man's responsibility to be, which is to protect for and to provide for and protect his family. And then when this is coupled with the stresses of not being able to do that, and with financial challenges, many tend to resort to violence and crime as coping mechanisms, and also as a means of continuing to exert their masculinity. But there are also other things that we are seeing in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as in Jamaica, that add to this. So for example, we saw that childhood experiences matter. So in Trinidad and Tobago, boys who were involved in violence before the age of 18 are incarcerated in greater numbers as compared to the general population of men, right? Men who prior to age 18 live with their mothers only, as compared to those who live with both parents, who are twice as likely to end up behind bars, as an adult. So these things contribute to what we are seeing. Men who have been victims of child abuse, or who were forced to have sex with someone as children, 1.7 times as likely to be imprisoned as adults, especially for similar crimes. And of course, attitudes towards women matter. So men in Trinidad and Tobago, men who tended to get angry if their partners spoke to other men, there's a correlation there in that they are 4.5 times more likely to be in prison. Men who then tended to see that traditional role, that woman's most important role is to take care of the household and cook for a family, those men were actually 1.5 times less likely to be in prison. But then those respondents who tended to be violent towards women, who tended to hit, kick, beat, choke, push, even burn their partner, those persons were 8 times more likely to be in prison. So when you look at the research, and when we look at Jamaica, a common feature throughout the themes or the constructions of masculinity was and is a man's relationships with his children. So when men see that they have that responsibility as provider and protector, and fatherhood and being a role model, all those things are linked to that man's relationship with his children. So again, while there's a dominant view that most men tend to believe the household chores are the domain of women, we saw more equitable views on childcare, and men, wanting to be more likely involved in activities relating to raising their children, especially disciplining their children. And we saw that correlation as well between these attitudes and whether or not these men were likely to end up incarcerated, right? Again, in Jamaica, men who tended to hold attitudes towards, being violent towards women, they were more likely to be incarcerated. Those who indicated for whatever reason they felt that a woman deserved to be beaten, again, they were 1.5 times more likely to be incarcerated. So essentially, our research is backing up what my fellow panelists have been saying, and we have to continue again to look at those intersections, whatever they may be: class, race, gender, family life, and we are looking at it now. Again, we are not blaming women or single parents households for crime, but we are highlighting that some of these attitudes that still persist are attitudes that need to be changed so that we could continue to massage the issues and work towards reducing that gender-based violence. I think back to what Ms. Mutola spoke about with respect to the levels of fear in which we all would have at the moment, especially in Trinidad and Tobago with our high murder rates, our continuing violence that we are seeing daily. So we clearly have issues that need to be worked on, attitudes that need to be changed. And, we are happy to be here to work together to speak on these issues. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Baskerman. I'm just looking at the chat here, and some of our persons who have joined us, participants, have really and truly accentuated points that were made by some of the panelists, talking about society having, Maxine McKay talking about society having stereotypes. Boys are taught to be masculine, girls taught to be feminine, and we have to consider issues around social exposure, upbringing, experiences from childhood, adulthood, things around family structure, punishment, these types of things, gender stereotypes that are also perpetuated in schools, according to Deborah McMillan, and even exposure to intimate partner violence at a very early age during infancy, having that effect on the emotional and cognitive development of children, and they taking that into adulthood and affecting their relationships and how they respond to situations of conflict, not even male-female relationships, but situations where they're involved in conflict as well, right? And having these conversations as well. And on the point of intersectionality, Marcus Kassoon asks this question, and it's a very interesting question, I believe, looking at now, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, we're seeing this discriminatory analysis of crime and victimology. And therefore that speaks to what we're talking about with intersectionality, looking at race and class and structure. He didn't put in class in there, but I'm going to put class in there as well, being an issue when we start talking about violence in the Caribbean and persons' involvement in crime, right? There's this racial discourse and going on as well in our analysis of it. So asking this question about what are we missing as researchers and policymakers and as a society to unpack crime when we're engaging in this analysis of crime, right? And therefore, I think when we talk about gender, we also have to talk about race and culture. And one of the key issues around feminist discourse is, I believe it is Lorraine Gilstrap talks about this in, not only are we talking about understanding the reality, empiricism, and all these things, but we're talking about this deconstruction, breaking down existing categories of knowledge. That's what we need to start doing when it comes to, and just answering that question of unpacking crime and how what we're missing as researchers. We have to start deconstructing things and start probably even looking at things from a post-colonial perspective. Ken Price talks about towards a Caribbean criminology, and he says, you know what, we need to include this understanding of colonialism and what the impact it's had on us as a people, not only about who men are, who women are, but also the family structure, matrifocal societies that we have in the Caribbean. I think it's Barto and some persons, I think it's out of Martinique, did some research on women and gender, and they talked about this issue of matrifocality, and it needs to be, even in the Francophone Caribbean, it needs to be further explored. Right. So in light of the conversation that we've just had, I want to move along to looking at bringing conversation now, the concept of security and peace, because CARICOM Declaration proposes to develop and implement integrated targeted programs and strategies to address young, vulnerable youth at risk and becoming perpetrators and victims of crime, right? But part of that would be, a larger part of that falls under the larger concept of peace and security and in the region, right? And this idea of security and understanding what security is, because if we go back to a conversation about, even if you're looking at this public health interventions in relation to crime, and we refer to as some of us refer to as epidemiological criminology, and looking at that nexus between epidemiology and crime, and how applying this public health approach. Part of that will be ensuring person security, right? So when we speak of regional national security and public security, what are we talking about? What is the conversation that we're having? Because these issues around gender and crime and women's involvement in criminal, as victims and as offenders, and small arms and violence, it's all about concepts of security and peace, because we're in societies that are in conflict, right? And so we have to ask this ourselves. What do we mean? What does security mean? Because security is perceived above all in terms of human needs, right? So when we talk about security, what do we mean? Are we centering citizen security and the protection of safety and well-being of all people? So whose security is being guaranteed when we talk about peace and security, when we talk about programs and strategies to address these issues of crime or risk, becoming at risk perpetrators and victims of crime? So what I would like to do now is bring into this conversation Ms. Mutota, Dr. McPhee, and even Dr. Aglessis. So let's go with Ms. Mutota first.
You want me to respond to the question around security and human security? Yeah. Can I? Oh.
Yes, please. Yes, my question.
Okay, and you're hearing me clearly. I think that the human security issues are costlier and a long term. And Deborah McPhee spoke to that issue earlier in terms of the human security concerns that we should be addressing, because these human security concerns are less sexy than physical infrastructure and cars and weapons for the police and that sort of thing, crime fighting campaigns. And they're less sexy, I think, as well than the public utterances of care and understanding and abiding faith that we hear so many of our leaders make, on and on and on. But world military expenditure in 2022, it rose by 3.7%. And of course, we know 2022 is still in the COVID-19 pandemic and so on and so forth. And everybody's complaining that there's insufficient money to expend on health and education and employment and all those sorts of things. But in terms of people selling weapons, there was an increase. Of course, a lot of people would say that that is because of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is that world military expenditure rose. It didn't rise by 1%. It rose by 3.7%, you know, over $22-40 billion. So there is money around and there's expenditure happening, but it's expenditure on arms, conventional arms, and so on. And so the work really is to challenge this militarism and the arms trade. And I think in that regard, the position taken by CARICOM to join the Mexico initiative is quite welcome and points us in the right direction, because there has to be, if I were to bring it back home, there has to be some review of the militarization of public security. It's interesting to me that in the midst of the fear and insecurity we're experiencing right now, in Trinidad and Tobago, if I were to take it as an example, that the recommendations that are being proposed are the same things that we've been doing repeatedly over at least 2 decades. And it seems as if it's coming from the same quarters, and people are just happy to be making the same recommendations. I think that, and going back to your earlier discussion, there's a problem with this concept of inherent criminality. Who are the people we see as the perpetrators? And I mean, I really want to acknowledge that we are seeing a lot of young men. The ethnicity question is before eyes, the age, the urban nature of their living and that sort of thing. But I think that historically, we have come to really sort of frame certain groups of people as inherently criminal. And I think in a lot of ways, it makes it easy for us to bring harsh measures against those communities, and to blame and shame them, whether it is in their role as mothers, or in their role as community leaders. But I think that we have to deal with the question of this way that we see particular groups of people, and that we've already determined that there's an inherent criminality among that group, whether it's from the area you come from or any other variable. And I think that that is problematic in us when we talk about looking for solutions. And that is something that has to be addressed. So in the context, I think, of human security, we've got to come to terms with the biases that we bring to our own discussion, analysis, and treatment of the problem that is before us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mututa. Dr. McPhee, you want to jump in here and have an input?
Yes, I want to jump in. When we talk about human security, excuse me, I think like violence, we have these narrow definitions, and then if we're honest, we'd have to broaden the definitions. So when we talk about human security, many times we're talking about securitization, but we're not having those, we're not engaging with issues of freedom from fear. We're not talking about freedom from want. We're not talking about the freedom to live in dignity. We're not talking about the freedom to make decisions. And these are the broader areas. If I were to say freedom from want within this Caribbean context, and to try to connect that to the crime conversation, it would push me to say, okay, let's look at something like youth unemployment. Those are the type of conversations those are the types of intersections that I'm looking to. When we look at our labor market and we begin to have a conversation specific to issues of decent work and those connections, because once you begin to have a conversation around human security and you leave it in the realm of citizen security and you leave it in the realm of securitization, you have robbed yourself of the analysis. Yeah. And I think it's really important that once we begin to have those conversations, then we must then say, what of the data? Yeah, because what is the basis on which we are coming to these conclusions that we are making? Yeah. So I look and I listen, but I'm going back to the labor data. Where are we in the labor market? Let me tell you, I went digging to look for this, to prepare for this particular conversation. And the data I found on the labor market regionally was from 2008. And it was highlighting the fact that our youth unemployment was very high regionally, and unemployment among young women was higher than that of young men. And the ways in which the process where you leave school, the process of school to work is one that is very difficult. And so I'm saying all that to say, when we're talking about human security, that conversation cannot be just right here in securitization. I want to understand about freedom from fear. I want to understand freedom from want. And I'm very intrigued by the fact when Dr. Alexis talked about it's important that governments work with civil society, because to make sense of these conversations, many times our templates, our models for data collection don't make room for that kind of data to be collected. Yeah, so Kariman, Mr. Bascom spoke clearly about what they are collecting. And there are these alternate data sets that need to now form part of the public policy conversation. Yeah, so I'm pausing here. But what I am saying is, it is really important for me, for us to begin to frame this conversation beyond securitization, beyond those very limited conversations. And for as long as we do this, we are limiting how we understand violence also, because there's a connection there. If your human security means the gun, then your violence means the homicide. And that is very important. Yeah, how do we think beyond these easy connections and shift it to a more intersectional conversation?
Thank you, Dr. McPhee. It's very interesting what you said there, because I too, looking at this issue on human security, brought up this thing about before in 1994 is where we have this concept of human security being introduced, looking at 7 dimensions: food, health, environmental, personal, community, political, you know, so all these things, and that freedom freedom of expression, all these things are part of the human security dynamic. So, and it's very interesting that you said it's securitization versus the freedom, that conversation. That's the conversation, you know, we need to be talking about securing guns, then we're talking about homicides, you know. So I want to bring Dr. Alexis very quickly into this conversation about looking at the policy relevance of the concept of human security in particular, right? And how, looking at in particular CARICOM, and where are we going when we talk about human security and this conversation in relation to gender and violence and all these things? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, thank you. Let me use citizen security as an overall concept that would cover, you know, that really is synonymous to human security. I think persons here would perhaps recall that Tony Harriot of the University of the West Indies, Mona, and the Crime Center there, would have a few years ago conducted an analysis on citizen security in the Caribbean. That has helped shape a lot of the thoughts within the regional society and the partners involved in addressing issues of crime and violence from a humanistic perspective. The issues really relate to our ability to address conflict resolution. We have a system, I think Dr. McPhee referred to, you know, with the treating of crime as, you know, from a negative perspective. These were not your exact words, Dr. McPhee, but that's what I think you were generally referring to. That's an issue. But we really have to see crime and violence as a societal issue that requires a certain kind of intervention. The work done by Tony Harriot focused largely on ensuring that there is an understanding of citizen security above and beyond the investments in crime fighting, above and beyond what my colleague, you know, indicated earlier were the investments in the vehicles, the motorcycles, the batons, the guns for the police stations. How do we engage the society in the softer issues, social issues, restorative justice, interventions that allow our people to fully understand what it means to engage in conflict resolution? How do we return our society to one where the level of tolerance, which allowed us to deal with conflict, because there is no human society that exists without conflict. And it is our inability to manage conflict that results in violence. It is not the fact that conflict exists. There will always be conflict. But how we address those issues, and therefore much of the emphasis from a citizen security perspective has to be placed on our ability to resolve those conflicts before they escalate to the level of criminal activity. That is probably easier said than done because, again, the intersectionalities that Dr. McPhee referred to has also to do with our ability to meet basic needs. So our societies have to be societies that allow all the boats to be afloat at the same time. And that means that our economies have to be enhanced. That means that our ability to satisfy basic needs must be improved. That means that our education system must ensure that it instills in our younger people a sense of pride, a sense of civic responsibility. And these are the issues that will contribute largely to citizen security. CARICOM has a civil society charter that has not been utilized, if I were to be brutally honest, has not been utilized to its fullest potential. And we are currently paying great attention to how it is that we engage the society through the use of the civil society charter, which has been approved by the heads of government, which exists for us to be able to define the boundaries within which we involve others, other than just the officials who attend our quartets and our COSODs and our COFABs and our COFCORs and our heads of government meeting. These are all official, very important avenues for policy making and for the taking of decisions. But we have to go beyond that. This Caribbean civilization that we are all a part of and we all must protect is a civilization that goes beyond the sphere of elected governments. Our civil society, and we have had a very, very long history in the Caribbean of effective civil society organizations, and we have to create space for those civil society organizations. There are some very, very good examples taking place in the Caribbean right now. If I were to focus, for example, on an example that is being promoted in St. Lucia, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia highlighted the fact that not sufficient space is being created for young people to be involved in the economic advancement of the country. And therefore, he has created within his own ministry, the Youth Economy program. That Youth Economy program has been capitalized with, if I'm not mistaken, $10 million. And efforts are being made to ensure that young people's hobbies are turned into businesses and their passions and their skills turned into enterprise. And that has created tremendous space for those young people with brilliant ideas who perhaps cannot meet the requirements of our banking system to be able to access resources, access the necessary funding to bring the creative juices to fruition and to establish their businesses. That is an example of a policy response to the issues that we're faced with. There are other examples around the Caribbean that we can highlight, but I thought that particular one, given how innovative it is, there were many questions about what is the youth economy, how do we define a youth economy, how do we get young people engaged in the process of the youth economy, and that is an example that I'm hoping at some point we would be able to review this particular initiative and to see to what extent it can be scaled up, it can be replicated across the Caribbean. I recall doing some work in Belize a number of years ago, and Belize had a program. I think Trinidad also had such a program, second chance programs for young persons who have had challenges with the law. And the linking of those young people who have had problems with the law, some young people have been incarcerated, some of them, with the business sector, so that the program allows an immediate reintegration into society, where those young people can now become productive citizens in the society, understanding that they too have a responsibility to ensuring the safety and security of those whom they come in touch with. So the issue has to be beyond just the infrastructural investments. It has to be on the softer side of socialization. It has to be ensuring that our families are equipped by ensuring that basic needs are addressed, taken care of, because, you know, if you were to think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if your basic needs are not adequately addressed, you would certainly have difficulty in addressing the needs at the higher end of the hierarchy. So our societies have to come together. Obviously, the leadership of our governments, the social agendas that are facilitated through the official channels must be emphasized, but it will require much more than just that. It will require a whole of society approach.
Thank you, Dr. Alexis. And starting a conversation a bit more again, I have a question for Ms. Basco with regards to what we've just heard from Dr. Fee, Dr. Alexis, Ms. Mutota on the issue of security. This conversation, all these approaches, what's been said, what does this require of approaches to power and leadership and the forms of male leadership that are modeled? Like what does this require of approaches to power and leadership, especially where you have forms of male leadership that are being modeled, you know?
So to just come in, some of the things that Dr. Alexis was highlighting definitely are what we need. We need to now engage through our leadership or through civil society to have different transformative interventions. So whether it be advocating for more youth-friendly spaces, advocating for more instances of restorative justice and rehabilitation. A good example in Trinidad and Tobago right now through the Children's Court is the drug treatment court, and how they are trying to treat with those children who find themselves in conflict with the law there. We want to continue to engage young men and young women in age-appropriate peer mediation. We want to treat with our leadership to then, tend to focus on these issues. Look again at our education system. Look again at our home and community environments that perpetuates in a culture of violence. We want to have more accessible, confidential, safe support spaces. So we really need to push our leadership to look at those aspects of treating with our issues as opposed to the traditional or narrow focus issues of just treating violence with also violent responses, just treating with engaging with men only in a reactive way instead of looking at additional approaches that would be more transformative. I hope I'm answering in that way. Yes.
Thank you very, very much. So right now, what I would like to do would be to open the floor just for maybe two questions from our participants. So if you could just quickly raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, and we'll facilitate that. All right, so I see one hand up. MF, okay, I'm not sure. So please unmute your mic and let's.
Hi, good morning. It's Maria Pontinel. And yeah, it's so much information and it's just so refreshing, although some of it is repeated, but it's so refreshing to hear. And I particularly want to say how refreshing it is to hear males advocate some of these perspectives and points of view, because especially as I'm involved in LGBTQ plus advocacy, we often hear males saying to us, oh, there's so many issues with males, why can't we work more on these issues? But it's good to see that men are also working on these issues, because there is that space and they should be able to create that space to work specifically with that demographic. And it really is pleasing to hear males espouse those views and are working towards ensuring that we continue not just in a balanced way, but in a balanced and progressive way forward in the Caribbean.
Thank you. And we have Charles Cambridge, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, what I've noticed in different civil organizations that I'm involved in, quite a bit of young ladies have expressed themselves about wanting to work. Some of them go away to school, come back with a college degree, university degree, and can't find a job that they majored in. And sometimes they are ashamed to go and work in a small job like a maid or bartender, whatever. And they find themselves, some men prey on them. They find themselves prostituting themselves. And then some of them mean well, and some of them are unable to afford their family for them to go away to college. And so what happens is, sometimes with a little help, I think we can do more as women in our society by helping them with applications and also dress code. Some of them really don't have the means. I hired a young lady one time in my business, and I noticed I normally would buy the vest and give them the tie to put on to go as a greeter at the airport. She didn't even have a pair of shoes. She didn't have a pants or a skirt. Her hair, didn't even have money to go and get her hair done. So sometimes they mean well and they find themselves in a different situation. And I feel as women, not just doing photo op and going to meetings, but put our money where our mouth is and try and assist. If everyone can help one, we can't change the world, we can't save the world. But if every one of us here in this Zoom meeting today, if we could just help one person, I think that would be a help in all of our societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we do understand that there are issues around, and I believe Dr. McPhee talked about this issue around poverty and employability and stuff like that, that can influence these issues, right? So when we're talking about human security, we do need to talk about this conversation around not only securitization, but freedom from want and all these different freedoms that exist, that form a larger understanding of the concept of human security. So what I want to do now is run that conversation along now to, we've talked about the issue, but we need to start talking about the solution. And more importantly, gender responsive action planning, right? So very quickly, I want to invite Dr. Alexis to give us a brief overview. What are some of the existing types of policies and laws in the region that are in place to combat crime, but also that are in place to be gender inclusive as well?
Okay, let me start with the proverbial elephant in the room, right? Look, we must all as Caribbean citizens abhor crime and violence at all levels. Do not harbor criminals. Be supportive of law enforcement agents in our countries. Allow the police to do their work. I've been seeing a lot of videos across the length and breadth of the Caribbean where any action by the police, no matter how correct the police is executing their duty, the intolerance showed by the society towards law enforcement is frankly unacceptable. We tend to blame, government must do X and government must do Y. I accept that governments have to do what they need to do, but we also as citizens, we have a responsibility. As long as there is no overreach or any infringement on the rights of people, we should allow the police to curb the antisocial behavior that we see around us. As society, we are obligated to guiding our youth to understand the consequences of their behavior that serve as gateways sometimes to more serious infringements that can be defined as criminal behavior. Our responsibility, therefore, as a society, is to teach our children the path they should follow. I want to really and truly start with that because the saying that when we point one finger towards someone, there are three other fingers pointing to us. And therefore, we have to take responsibility as citizens of our region to guide our young people and to ensure that we contribute towards the solution or interventions that would result in curbing our current problem. Of course, on the grander scale, we need legislative and policy reforms. And again, there are many countries in the Caribbean that have moved towards legislative and policy interventions. We do have a problem, I must admit, in the implementation sometimes. Every member country, for example, in the Caribbean have ratified the the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women and Against Women, the CEDAW Convention. But the extent to which we're in a position to implement these sometimes can be a little problematic. Also, our ability to report on our international obligations can be a bit of a problem. I think the third thing I want to suggest is that there needs to be institutional capacity building. And when I say institutional capacity building, I don't want this phrase to be taken as part of the usual rhetoric around capacity building, because I sometimes believe that we say capacity building very glibly in this region. But I do believe that we need to build structures, both the formal state structures, our institutions. I am from St. Lucia, and I have followed very closely what is happening with the Boys Training Center in Massad, Grosile, the weakening of those structures, the absence of proper rehabilitative programs for young persons who have had infractions with the law. We cannot, as a society, fence out young people who are under the age of 18. It is counterproductive, because those young people must return to the societies. And therefore, whilst, there is a lot of conversation about, how robust is the perimeter fence, for young juveniles who have been made wards of the state for various reasons, we need to shift the emphasis and place the emphasis on rehabilitating those young people, make them understand that there is hope in life. And it is through those policy means that we're going to shift our society into places where we can all survive and we can all live harmoniously with each other. The final area for me is that we should also ensure that our ability to analyze the problems that we face. And in that analysis, I want to again use the theme of today's discussion, ensuring that there is an understanding of some of the feminist theoretical perspectives, because crime has been seen traditionally as an issue for men. We have to take on board a wider view of how we analyze crime, and ensuring that that analysis includes a feminist perspective as well. That will lead us to issues of ensuring that there is proper gender mainstreaming in the interventions that we put forward. It will ensure that our women and girls are not just seen as a demographic to be protected, but also a demographic to be engaged in finding solutions. Because again, it is not just about, doing something for, but doing with. And I think as a society, we need to begin to expand as much as possible. My very, very final point in terms of how I see us going forward is that our societies have to be more responsive to the needs of our men and boys, not to take away from all of the issues affecting the entire society, the wholesomeness of our society. But the point was raised earlier by, I think it was one of the individuals who spoke from the floor. The issue was raised about girls and their qualification, but yet they're not able to find suitable jobs. That is what I presented earlier on as the reasons why many boys have absented themselves from formal education, because the education system is not in sync with the job market. And therefore, if the traditional definition of manhood, which I believe need to be deconstructed, it has not yet been deconstructed, and therefore it is what currently exists. And as a construct that currently exists, if the education system is not preparing our boys for for performing that role, and we're also not doing enough to change the role, then our boys will continue to be marginalized. And as a society, we have a responsibility to remove the blinkers, to open up our eyes, to be objective, and to be able to take the hard decisions that need to be taken. Many of those hard decisions sometimes have to be inspired by civil society, and governments respond. In the cases where governments lead on those issues, they obviously would require civil society to come on board as active partners. I'll stop here for the time being.
Great. Thank you very much for Dr. Alexis. That's a very comprehensive understanding of what's happening and what should be happening and what we need to happen. So in light of what you said, and you talked about gender mainstreaming. So what I would like to do now is invite Dr. McPhee, Ms. Mutota, and Mr. Basco Morton into the conversation to have their input about their thoughts on how can we incorporate a gender responsive approach to policy and programs on crime prevention and peacekeeping. So first we'll go to Dr. McPhee, then Ms. Mutota, then Mr. Basco.
I will go back and then I'll come forward. Forgive me. I'm a student of history. In 1979, Dr. Justin Messiah, out of the Cayfield campus, did a study on Caribbean women. And this study was the Women in the Caribbean Project. And one of the things that she and her team came up with, and it was all over the Caribbean, a few territories as well. She spoke to the fact that Caribbean women have always worked. Caribbean people were transported into this space after the obliteration of our first peoples. Caribbean peoples were brought into this space to work, and Caribbean women have always worked. And I think it's important that when we speak to the issues around crime, we are very mindful of that. So the sexual division in the Caribbean has always been a different one, in that whether it is that women work in the informal sector, whether it is they work in the formal sector, they have worked. So the issue of weighing children and childcare have always been an issue for Caribbean women. And I think it's very important for us. And why I'm speaking to this project, the project had a number of policy recommendations, because that was a big part of the project. So what am I saying? We have standing policy recommendations around this issue of gender mainstreaming. Yeah? They did far back beyond the Women in the Caribbean project. But I'm bringing this project to our minds because I'm saying it is not different where we are today. We are still contending with issues of childcare. We are still contending with issues of shared divisions of labor, and we're still contending how do you manage the household and how do you manage private and public spaces and community spaces. So this is still a conversation that is very, very, very long for us, both in the terms of policy and both in terms of research. So for me, when we talk about moving forward, I think it's very important that we understand our context, that we spend some time deliberating on the reality of us and the complexities of us. Yeah? Because I'm coming right back, the weighing of geography and access and clear, I think it's very important that we spend some time looking back, not finding new things, I would love for us to spend some time just looking back and seeing the recommendations that have gone before. Yeah? And reasoning around what is our society looking like for real? Yeah? Not what we believe it to be. And that will require, I heard, active partnership of civil society. And what is that active partnership, particularly in the issue of the social sector? Active partnership with civil society has historically meant that the parts of the work of the state get shifted onto civil society to be provided at costs that the state would never even consider paying for it. And so we really need to work through what that active partnership will look like. And I could go on, but I'm not going down a road, but I really want us to disturb this idea of this active partnership. What does it look like? What is the cost of it? And also the issue of the power relations. We're talking about feminist conversations. Power relations are always important when we're having feminist analysis. So what is that power relations within the context of this active partnership between the state and civil society? Yeah? So I repeat it. Please, can we please get a sense of our reality? Caribbean women have always worked. So I really, don't tell me it is because we're working, it has so much crime now. That is something that we really need to work through and make sense of. Let's unpack that, yeah? And what is this active partnership we're talking about? And what are the relations of power and the hierarchies that are being recreated within that active partnership? I will stop here. Thank you.
All right. So I will thank you very much, Dr. McPhee. Very interesting, and you're quite right. We've always worked. Again, this author, I can't remember the name of the author, but talking about even in the Francophone Caribbean, I'm talking about matrifocality, said women have always worked, and sometimes we place women in the Caribbean in this victim role, but when we talk about stories about Caribbean women, they aren't really necessarily always victims, but they're sometimes they seem to be superheroes as well. And so the conversation about crime and security as well, we need to actually figure out, we have always been in the labor market as workers, and they're doing everything as well. So I want to go across now to Ms. Mutota and then Mr. Bascom about this same question about gender responsive approaches to policy. How can we incorporate these gender responsive approaches to policies and programs on crime prevention and peacekeeping? So Ms. Mutota.
Thank you very much, moderator. I want to start by saying that I endorse every single thing that Deborah just said. That's my firm position. I also want to make an observation. I think it's important to bring it to our attention. We've spent the last almost 2 hours talking about gender and crime and security and violence and so on. And the conversation really has pretty much situated the players into men and women, male and female. And we've not at all engaged, perhaps we did and it escaped me, so I apologize if it did. We've not engaged with the business of sexuality and non-binary people. And I think that in itself has to say something to us about our understanding of, and we said earlier, our lived reality. But more importantly, a culture really that is quite discriminatory, and Deborah just talked about the hierarchical nature of our power relations. So that is something that I want to bring to our attention. And I know it wasn't deliberate, but as we, it's these conversations help us really to get a check on where we are at, the extent to which and how we're evolving and so on. So it's important that we try to get as many issues as possible on our radar. we've been talking, and I want to ask the question, who are we talking about? Who are we talking about? I don't know that that has been defined sufficiently, certainly for me. Who are we talking about when we talk about men and masculinity, when we talk about violence and crime and small arms violence and that sort of thing? Who are we talking about? Because, and I'm asking the question because I think that our framing of crime and violence allows us to identify particular communities, those underserved communities, communities that experience poverty. It allows us to identify social class, particular ethnicities, you know, particular geographic spaces. We've become quite comfortable with defining our problem and defining crime and violence as problems as a result of these communities. And in so doing, it does not allow us really sufficient understanding, identifying, targeting the supply chain. It doesn't allow us to engage sufficiently with the issue of corruption. So that the hierarchies that have and continue really to structure even our thinking are very present in our conversation around gun crime. So that the problem is that set of people. They've been like that forever. They don't listen. There's a bunch of women who are growing. One woman I saw on social media this week for Mother's Day, she chose to say, mothers are creating monsters. And that was her position on Mother's Day. So that we've got to look at a culture that marginalizes certain groups of people and are totally blind, is totally blind to other groups of people who are also involved, contributing, creating, and nurturing this violence that we're all experiencing and are afraid of. So I want to make that point. And therefore, how do we challenge the status quo? And does our youth innovation challenge the status quo that privileges some groups over other groups? And that makes a whole lot of us very uncomfortable and spend our entire life trying to get out of this social class that I've been born into, because I am invisible if I remain there. How do we challenge a status quo that creates that kind of culture? Earlier we talked about the violent masculinity, and I wanted to say to you that I don't necessarily agree with this point about you know, that men are violent or whatever was the point. I think that violence is a marker of power, a toxic power, and that in our ordering of society, men are at the top of the food chain, and consequently, they may have more power than women, and therefore they use violence that is allowed to them, that all of us allow and accept that that it is okay for men to exercise a certain amount of violence. And we see it in how they manage personal relationships in their relationships with women, and in their relationships with organizations, with position and authority. And so it's all played out there, but it is played out because it is acceptable because of the power that they have. So I think that we need to really examine how power is practiced, how it is received, how it is accepted, and the extent to which we're comfortable with a violent power in our homes, in the society, and wherever have you. And so I think that one of the last points I want to make is the business about the inclusion of women. When we talk about gender responsive, you're not, unless we come to terms with the culture and the norms that many of us embrace, that situate women in particular places and spaces, then talking about transforming that security architecture to be more embracing of women and that sort of thing is not going to take us to where we want to get to. We've got to deal with the business of the cultural norms and practices that create and nurture all of us in a particular kind of way to accept and expect certain things. And we also have to deal with the fact that a lot of us have fought really hard to increase the numbers of women in positions of authority. And so we have an expanded number of women in the security sector, for example. But we need to understand that we've got to go much further now. The work has been done in terms of the numbers. We want to have that qualitative difference so that the organization can boast of a number of or increased numbers of women, for example, in their middle management. What is the quality of the experience of those women within that organization? To what extent has the culture been transformed so that not only women experience a more inclusive culture, but also the men and everyone else in the organization learn and experience that alternative culture of respect and do no harm, so that we don't have to deal with issues of sexual harassment and gender disinformation, etc., so that the policy may be in place where the organization has a policy on sexual harassment, but the culture has not been dealt with. And so we need to bring those together. And we also need to ensure that as we grow the numbers of women representing us in spaces that have historically not been very open, that we also grow their consciousness and commitment to women's rights. So, and our support for them, those of us who are on the outside, so that they can bring about change within the organizations by choice. Let me leave it there because I know time is against you. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you. And just very quickly, Mr. Bascom, I'm going to throw this out to you as well. How can we incorporate a gender responsive approach to policies and programs on crime prevention and peacekeeping? Your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are many at the moment based upon the feedback of my fellow panelists, because I guess I'm just reflective. So while we're looking at ensuring in rejecting violence in all forms in the region, and knowing that we must have, a multi-sectoral approach to capacity building, to strengthening, to having collaboration, whether it's at the individual level, community level, societal and structural levels. And while we are doing all of that, my brain has now gone to through what lenses are we approaching the issues, whether we are researchers, whether we are scholars, whether we are part of civil society organizations or faith-based organizations, or whether we are policymakers. What lenses are we looking at the issues from? Who are we focusing on and who are we excluding? At what point are we looking at the generational differences in which we look at the issues? What are our children seeing when they come up in a society that seems to be increasingly violent, and they may not be fully aware of the historical context of all that we are speaking of. So forgive me, because I guess listening to the ladies in particular has me now in a reflective space, and my brain is going into different areas as opposed to trying to summarize. Essentially, we really have to be careful in terms of what lenses we are looking at the issues from, ensuring that in advocating to address the issues or working together to address the issues ourselves, we are as all-inclusive as possible and as cognizant of whether it's the history, whether it's the various cultural contexts, whether it's whatever dynamic, that we are then able to treat with it from as inclusive a lens as possible. As I said, my brain is everywhere at the moment. So I'll end there. I know we're out of time.
Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Bascom. But yes, we got a lot of food for thought from all of you, all of our panelists today. I think the thing that comes to mind to me most importantly when we're talking about the feminist perspective is there needs to be a systematic analysis of gender, power, and social difference. That's what it comes down to, I think. What we're all seeing is that whether we are looking at violence, we're looking at violence in the home or violence in the communities, whether we're looking at human security, whether we're looking at gender responsive planning and stuff like that, there needs to be analysis of more so power and social difference and how these things interact, because these are the things that influence how we engage in our communities, in our societies, in leadership, in our understanding of crime and crime prevention. And then on top of that, we layer those things with our new epidemiological approach, where we talk about, when it's going back to looking at the crime and violence as a health issue. How can we merge these things, and asking ourselves, how are we to include the issue of gender, understanding that it affects men and women differently, and understanding social difference, understanding on things around the criteria for citizenship, because that also, how we see citizenship also affects these issues of masculinity and feminine, not just masculine and femininity, but power, and who has the power to do what, and where power lies, I think. And also it affects what we understand to be the freedom from want and our understanding of human security and that concept of it. So we understand that there's a need for, again, this kind of deconstruction within the approach of our understanding of crime and violence, but also, as I said before, analysis of gender, power, and social difference, and understanding those things. And I use social difference as a very large term to encapsulate all that has been said, whether it be sexuality, looking at issues of race and class and structure and all these things, right? So I just want to give each panelist no more than 1 minute to give us your final thoughts as well. So we'll start with Dr. Alexis, then go to Dr. McPhee, Ms. Mutosa, and Mr. Bascom.
I'm sorry, I was speaking through a muted microphone. So thanks again for this opportunity to engage you. It really has been a pleasure, and you know, when we think of the status quo which currently dominates the prism of analyzing crime, we understand that much of it is premised on you know, using definitions, using theories that do not sufficiently capture the role that women can play in the process. So I want to thank all of us who participated in this very lively and elucidating conversation this morning and into the early parts of the afternoon. There is still a lot of work to be done. You know, there was, I think it was Selwyn Ryan from UWI St. Augustine who coined the phrase that we suffer in the Caribbean an analysis paralysis. We tend to be very good at analyzing the problems, but we're not as good as finding the solutions and implementing the correct measures that will result in bettering the situation. I do hope that today's conversation would have inspired all of us and would lead us towards finding the solutions that are necessary and implementing them effectively enough that we begin to reap the results as a Caribbean civilization. So thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this very illuminating conversation today.
Thank you. Dr. McPhee.
Like Dr. Alexis, I must first say thank you. Thank you to Sewell for the opportunity to be here in this space. Thank you, my fellow panelists, for taking the time out of your morning and early afternoon to be with us. And thank you so much, Madam Chair, for your skillful management of the process. For me, I honestly will like to, I'm returning to the feminist analysis. I see value in it. I urge us to shift beyond the constructing of the enemy. This crime is a wicked problem, so it's a very complex, very nuanced problem. So it is not that one group is against us, as Ms. Matuta said, but we really need to make sense of the intersections and live beyond othering persons. You know, that in itself is a very critical tenet of feminist analysis, the way in which we other people. And the question I really would like to leave with us is who are we missing? Because it comes from that other aspect of the analysis that says it's important in the analysis that I make the invisible visible. So in the whole conversation, in the whole crime conversation, for me, it's really important that we make sense of who we're missing and working through that crime beyond homicide, and how do we make a more nuanced, a more complex conversation regionally, and a conversation of ourselves, that we seek to understand ourselves very, very clearly. So I will stop there. Thanks again.
Thank you. Ms. Mutosa.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you very much for steering us through the last hour or so, 2 hours, sorry. And thank you to the organizer, Sewell, for choosing to have this conversation. And thank you to my fellow panelists for choosing to invest your time and your thought with us today. It's all been beneficial. We'll all grow together. And we thank you for all that you do and the service that you provide to the people of the Caribbean. That's it for me, moderator.
Thank you. And Mr. Bascom.
Hi, I want to echo everyone's vote of thanks in terms of the organizers, moderator, as well as to my fellow panelists and attendees for us all engaging in a thought-provoking discussion. I'm pleased when I come to an event that doesn't just seem like a talk show, but you can actively see that those who are in various spaces are also active in attempting to address the issues that we all face. So with that, I would want to just encourage everyone to keep up your good work, to continue to engage as we continue to find solutions to these very complex issues. So thank you all.
Okay. Thank you very much to all the panelists. So I would like to now invite Ms. Sasha Sadio from Civil to just go through with us. I believe there's a poll, and yeah, just to close us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clegon. On behalf of Sewell, everyone, a tremendous thanks to all the panelists today and you as well, Dr. Clegon. Thank you all for taking the time to attend. We would really appreciate your feedback on the poll. You should see it up on your screen right now. We really value your feedback on that. The discussions today was so rich, and yet I feel like we could have delved into some topics a bit more, but we'll have to save that for another time. But, you know, there's still so much to take away from this conversation and reflect on in the context, like Dr. McPhee would have said, to reflect on in the context of our complex realities in the Caribbean. We're all affected by crime, and there's so much more that we can take away now from this conversation, reflect on and put into practice in our own lives, in our own spaces, as agents of change. So panelists, also, you know, you've made a lot of references to a number of reports, models, research, and articles. It would be great as well if Sewell can reach out to you soon after the session and ask you to share a few of these links and so on, and we can post them on the website. For those of you who are attending here, I know you might be interested. I saw some persons already sharing some links in the chat, but if we have these resources, we can post this on the website as well and let you all know. Again, thanks to all of you so much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon,
Again,
everybody.
please complete the poll
Bye-bye.
before you all leave. Please and thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.